Welcome to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflicts webinar series. Today we are so excited to have another installment in this series on the important topic of movement funding. Today's program is entitled Dollars and Dissent, How Donors Can Support Grassroots Organizing and Nonviolent Movements. And we are joined today by Benjamin Naimark-Rowse and Tom Perriello. Ben is the author of our newest study, Dollars and Dissent, which is now available from ICNC Press. And this is a book that really takes a deep dive into looking at what donors have been doing and can do better to support nonviolent movements and grassroots organizing. ICNC has taken a strong interest in this because it's such an important question when it comes to mobilizing effectively. Previous studies that we've done in the last year and a half include a book called The Role of External Support in Nonviolent Campaigns by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, which really looks at a quantitative look at how and what types of external support has been useful to movements. And then we've also looked at things from the recipient side, the movements themselves. So we've looked at resource mobilization, a book called Nonviolent Movements and Material Resources in Northwest Mexico, looks at 3 different case studies in that region, and how movements with very limited resources have been able to mobilize around their issues of concern. And just last month, we published Resource Mobilization in Palestinian Nonviolent Campaigns, looking at 3 different movements in Area C of the West Bank and what they've done with very limited resources. But today we're looking again from the donor side and what organizations can do to effectively support movements. These are movements that have shown from previous studies to be highly effective in affecting societal change, and yet the amount of support that we see going toward them is still very low. So we want to think what can be done to change that and to make it more effective. Ben's research looks at this by having conducted surveys to consider sort of the cross-section of the donor landscape, and also in-depth interviews to look at a more nuanced insight into what donors are doing successfully and effectively. And so we're going to turn it over to Ben for him to share his findings with us today. But first, I want to invite Rachel Thomas to share some as well. Rachel is the Director of Research Initiatives at the Human Rights Funders Network, who is co-sponsoring our event today. She has been involved in the conversation around this book long preceding the study itself, but also especially through the course of the study. And so we're glad to have Rachel here today. As you join, we invite you to participate in this discussion on Twitter. You can do hashtag ICNC webinars or tag us at Civil Resistance. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Bruce. It is a pleasure to be here and be part of the conversation today. As Bruce said, I direct research initiatives at Human Rights Funders Network. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a network that brings funders together to collaborate and strategize and really strengthen resourcing for human rights work around the world. And one of the big projects that we do is a research initiative. And we do it in collaboration with 3 other organizations. Those are Candid, which is a nonprofit that maps funding flows around the world for various issues, and 2 other donor networks, the Ariadne Network, which works with European funders, and then Prospera, the International Network of Women's Funds. And every year we undertake this large research initiative to map funding to support human rights work around the world. And we look at the issues that are being supported by foundations, the specific human rights issues. We look at the populations that are being prioritized. And we also look at the strategies that funders are using in their grant making. So are they promoting social change by supporting strategic litigation or legal aid or high-level advocacy or grassroots organizing? You can find all of our research at the website humanrightsfunding.org. And I give this as background because it was that research that really connected me to Ben. I had just been working with Human Rights Funders Network for about 2 months. I started there in February of 2018. And in April, I got a message from Ben, our first communication, and he wanted to talk to me about the data that we collect. And I tracked down that original message, and I want to read you a sentence from it because it's very pertinent to what we're talking about today. So Ben said, "I recently started a new research project that focuses on explaining how and why institutional donors support grassroots social movement building." Now, for those of you who already know Ben, you will know that he is a really glass half full kind of person. There's another side to that question. There's the question of why aren't donors supporting grassroots social movements? See, from where I sit, I do this research on a very bird's eye level, mapping funding very broadly. And year after year, we see that just about 3% of foundation funding to support human rights goes to support grassroots organizing. That's a really small percentage of this overall budget, which is already very small when you look at philanthropy at large and what could be possible. And so one of the reasons I am so excited about having been in this conversation with Ben for going on 4-ish years now, and really seeing this research come to fruition, is that Ben is taking us to the next steps. We know there's a scarcity, but what do we do about it? His research looks at the barriers to funders getting money to grassroots movements and organizing. He refers to them as the tensions in his report, and I know he'll go into those more. And he begins to move us toward solutions. What do we need to do to get more funding into the hands of movements on the front lines of human rights struggles? If you have ever grappled with that question as a donor, as a resource seeker, as an activist on the front lines, you are in the right place. That's exactly where we're going in this conversation and through Ben's research. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Ben, to tell us more about what you found.
Right. And let me take this moment to introduce all of you to our author, Benjamin Naimark-Rowse. He's the Topol Fellow in Nonviolent Resistance and a PhD candidate at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's a term member in the Council on Foreign Relations and a Truman National Security Fellow. Ben's expertise in social movements and resourcing of movements draws on 2 decades of experience in the donor, NGO, and academic worlds. He has served as a program officer with the Open Society Foundations, an electoral observer with the Carter Center, a board member of the University of Chicago's Human Rights Program, and an advisory committee member of the Leading Change Network. Ben holds an MPA from the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and a BA with honors from the University of Chicago. Thank you, Ben. We are so glad to have you here today, and we're looking forward to the discussion that unfolds from what you share with us.
You get a preview of the end of the presentation. Thanks so much, Bruce and Rachel, for the kind words. It's really been a pleasure working with both of you and your colleagues, and I'm so excited to be with all of you who've decided to take an hour out of your day to join the conversation. So I just start by saying that today, people around the world are participating in nonviolent collective action more than ever before in recorded history. And yet, as Rachel mentioned, only 3% of all human rights grant making goes to support this outpouring of people-powered politics. So today we're going to talk about the intersection of these 2 phenomena, dollars and dissent. So if you take away only one finding, one piece of information from today, it should be that foreign support is less important than domestic support for the success of grassroots organizing and nonviolent movements. So this point can frame how and should frame how foreign donors, NGOs, and policymakers relate to organizers and movement leaders. It should guide how we design grant-making portfolios and foreign assistance policies. And it sheds light on how we should think about monitoring and evaluation of this kind of support. And we're going to discuss all of these things and some more today. So now just a quick outline so you can see where we're going. First, we'll look at trends in funding from the data set and the work that Rachel mentioned that she co-leads. Then we're going to look at trends in people actually using grassroots organizing and nonviolent collective action. I'll share a couple of big takeaways from existing scholarship. I'm not the only one in academia studying this stuff. I'll share top-line findings then from my report, including from the survey of donors that I led and designed. And we'll dig deeper into donor-social movement relations by discussing the different trajectories that two donors, Humanity United and the American Jewish World Service, have taken in supporting grassroots organizing and nonviolent movements. Talk about donor coordination, and we'll finish with some actionable strategies and practices that you as donors can adopt and adapt in your particular context. I hope this information is also useful to any activists or policymakers or scholars who are here as well. You can find a detailed discussion of my research methods, definition of terms, etc., in the report itself. Feel free to ask me in the discussion. So first, we're going to follow the money. This image is from the Advancing Human Rights Initiative that Rachel mentioned. It's an initiative that documents donor support for human rights, broadly defined. It's defined by the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Donors whose grants appear in the data set are located all over the world, as are the grantees. And the data is compiled and managed by the four organizations Rachel mentioned, HRFN, Candid, Ariadne, and Prospera. So many thanks to them for collecting and coding and cleaning and making this data available. The data set covers 2011 to 2018. And it's the biggest data set of institutional donor support for human rights. There's another piece of their data that looks at bilateral and multilateral support, but right now, for today, we're focusing on the institutional donors. So this portion of the data set that you see sort of depicted here covers 2011 to 2015. And it shows trends year over year. So the dots, 5 dots in each of these colors are a year, 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15. This trends data set includes over $9 billion with a B, given in nearly 75,000 grants from over 550 foundations during this time period. And the chart shows funding disaggregated not by the goal of the grant, but by the strategy or strategies that the grantees said they would use to achieve their goal. And the grants are coded with one or more of these strategies. And the lines show how the total amount of money given to support each strategy changed year over year. I just want to focus you on the green, the sort of box in the middle. As Rachel said, from 2011 to 2015, institutional donors gave only 3% of their human rights funding to support strategies that included grassroots organizing. In the upper left-hand corner, you see that 31% of funding went to support strategies that involved advocacy, 14% went to capacity building, technical assistance, 11% to research and documentation, and so on. I'm not suggesting that one strategy is more effective than the others. There are contexts and times where all of these strategies can be useful. But advocacy and many forms of research and documentation tend to rely on a top-down or elite-based theory of change. A few lawyers doing litigation, a few really smart advocates who are going to meet with policymakers. Whereas grassroots organizing depends on bottom-up or grassroots theory of change, people power, regular people, all over from diverse sectors of society. So you can think of the difference between, for example, Human Rights Watch's work in Egypt, research and documentation and advocacy, versus the work of, say, the April 6th movement or other activist groups in Egypt. So in short, we, or donors, are supporting these top-down theories of change much more than the bottom-up ones. And I should just note that this trend continues in more recent years. You may say, but in 2016, 17, there's all sorts of talk of support for movements. But if we continue looking at this data from 2015 up until 2018, the most recent data available, the total share of money to grassroots organizing stayed at 3%. So why does it matter that only 3% of human rights funding went to support grassroots theories of change? First, nonviolent collective action, which includes organizing and movements, is twice as effective as violence at achieving the stated goals of those who are using it. 2, political transitions initiated through nonviolent collective action are 3 times as likely to lead to democracy as political transitions initiated through all other means. And 3, as we mentioned, we're living in an era where people around the world are using nonviolent collective action more than ever before in recorded history. So in short, nonviolent collective action is not only ubiquitous, it's effective. There may be all sorts of reasons why such a small percent of human rights funding goes to a strategy that's so effective and being used so often. My report and the rest of the presentation focuses on 3 related questions. Why do some donors support organizing and movements? How do they do it? And what can we learn from their experiences? So I'm focused on donor decision-making. I'm not researching the impact of donor support, although others have. I'm interested in why donors decide to support or not organizing and movements in the first place. So now I'm going to highlight 2 key findings from existing research, from other research. The first is that supporting organizing and movements requires a movement mindset. What does that mean? We can think about how movements differ from the grantees that receive more funding, the formal civil society organizations that do the advocacy and litigation and such. Formal CSOs tend to seek change primarily through institutional politics, like advocacy, litigation, and such. They have multi-year strategic plans, 501c3 equivalency status, boards, bank accounts, and professional development departments. Social movements, on the other hand, tend to seek change through extra institutional politics. That is to say, unlike formal CSOs, movements operate primarily outside of formal institutions. The entities that make up a movement often are not registered. They often don't have 501c3 equivalency status. Sometimes they don't even have a brick and mortar office, forget about a bank account or a development department. These differences mean that we need to have different ways of relating and even different mechanisms for thinking about supporting the work of grassroots organizing and nonviolent movements. My own research reinforces this idea of a movement mindset in a few ways. The first is that having a movement mindset does not mean that every donor has to support the rebels, the activists in the streets. Movements don't exist in a vacuum. Organizers and movements exist in an ecosystem of organizations that together make up a movement. Some donors have supported protection and legal aid to mitigate repression of organizers. Other donors have supported training for independent media and support for independent media to accurately cover activism in closed spaces. Other donors have supported research and documentation of human rights abuses so that when activists protest, they can say 25 people were tortured yesterday instead of the government is attacking us. Those are very different messages and evoke very different levels of precision and sophistication. So all of these types of support can foster movements and organizing. The second finding is that foreign support, as I mentioned earlier, is less important than domestic support for the success of organizing and movements. And we'll unpack that a little bit. Movements, one of the main forms of nonviolent collective action, they win primarily because of what they do within their countries, not because of the support they get from outside their countries. They win by mobilizing large numbers of people from diverse sectors of society. They win by building power and legitimacy within their communities. And there's this well-established research that shows this. This doesn't, however, mean that donors or outsiders should not offer support, but it does mean that our support for the work of movements should do a couple things. It should never undermine, but should foster movements' resiliency and legitimacy in the eyes of their own communities. It means our support should complement and not displace the resources, however small from our perspective, that movements generate autonomously. And that means asking at every step of our grant making or policy making, are we pushing our agenda or are we supporting their agenda? In order to get a better sense of why so little funding goes to organizing and movements, I conducted an online survey of donors. I wanted to capture the views of the broadest range of donors possible. It's an anonymous survey, consisted of 22 questions about donors' understanding of and experience with organizing and movements. It was disseminated to the email lists of these 3 networks. And I should just say it's not a random sample survey, so the results are not necessarily representative of all donors or all human rights donors, but it gives us a flavor of sort of where donors. So for the sake of time, I'm going to share only one of what I think are the most interesting findings from the survey. Respondents were asked to identify the primary constraint or constraints that keep their foundation from giving the level or type of support they think their foundation should be giving to organizing and movements. 7% reported that legal or tax concerns were primary constraint. 10% reported that something akin to lack of understanding was a primary constraint. I mentioned institutional groupthink or sort of internal failure amongst their colleagues to understand the power of movements. And a quarter reported that risks or threats to grantees or to foundation staff were a primary constraint. What about the other 60%, the majority of respondents? So nearly a quarter of respondents reported what I grouped together as sort of procedural considerations as being the primary obstacle or constraint to supporting organizing and movements. They mentioned difficulty getting funding to organizers and it was hard to monitor and evaluate that funding. They also said it was hard to navigate the legal restrictions and language differences in recipient countries. Over a quarter said that insufficient funds or staff capacity, the foundation, were a primary constraint. And about a third said that it just wasn't a priority. So the sort of values that the founders or board members or staff, directors at a foundation have may very well underlie these responses. But nearly a quarter of respondents said that sort of procedural considerations were a primary constraint. And as my report, my research, and other research shows, many donors, they've found solutions to overcome these procedural or sort of technical considerations like the ones the survey respondents mentioned. So solutions exist to help overcome these obstacles. And the last sort of quarter of the report is a compendium of practical examples with links and reports and sort of strategies, practices that donors have used and that any of you can adapt, adopt, and consider. And while the survey helped to uncover constraints donors face in supporting organizing and movements, I also wanted to understand why some donors do support organizing and movements and how they do it. 2 case studies, the American Jewish World Service and Humanity United, allowed me to dig deeper into why and how donors support organizing and movements. And I should just say here, I'm grateful to the leadership and staff and board members at both organizations, both donors, for opening up all sorts of material and possibilities to do interviews, to sort of look under the hood and understand and now share with you why and how these 2 donors support organizing and movements. So what's interesting for me about AJWS on the left and HU on the right is that both arrived at approaches to supporting organizing and movements that take into account the broader ecosystem. They don't just support organizers or activists. They support national, regional, and international grantees as well to connect, complement, and amplify the work of organizers and movements. You can see at the bottom of the slide, AJWS refers to their approach as a grassrooted approach, and HU refers to theirs as a systems approach or systems reform approach. the trajectories that these two donors took to get to this comparable place is very different. So I'll start with AJWS on the left. Lawrence Simon founded AJWS as a public charity in 1985 with a strategic partner. Simon, who had previously worked at Oxfam, hoped that the new organization would be the Jewish Oxfam, an identifiably Jewish disaster relief and development organization. AJWS started as a development organization supporting and building relationships with grassroots grantees. This is critical to understanding its evolution towards supporting movements and the whole ecosystem, because AJWS's first work tended to be with people who are thinking of grassroots and bottom-up approaches to cultivating land and building health systems and such. The knowledge and relationships that came from this work started to permeate AJWS as an institution and its grant-making processes. Over the years, they had two strategic planning processes, as well as staff who had previously been part of movements, and deep collegial relationships with other donors. And these things led AJWS to develop a tiered approach to grant making. That approach is now called Grassrooted. And it entails continuing to support and building relationships with grassroots partners, while also supporting the national, regional, international groups that complement and amplify the grassroots work. So it supports multiple parts of the social movement ecosystem. Now we'll shift to the right to HU. Pam and Piero Midyar formally founded HU as a private foundation in 2008. And they shared and still share a commitment to fostering citizen engagement in society. At that point, they sought to help eradicate two of the worst things people do to each other: mass atrocities and human slavery, in their words. And I think we would all agree. During its first years, HU supported civil society efforts in local contexts, and they emphasized support for grass tops advocacy and engagement, research and documentation, and mobilizing public opinion. Strategic reviews of its past grant making and of its atrocity prevention work led HU to make two shifts in its sort of work. The first was a shift to focus on changing systems rather than symptoms, as an interviewee described it. This was in line with embrace of systems thinking by other Omidyar-supported organizations. The second shift was related, and through a pilot project, convening of experts, and consultations with local partners, HU shifted away from the goal of atrocity prevention into a goal of transforming peace-building systems around the world. Their peace-building portfolio seeks to amplify the power of local peace builders and make the global peace-building system more responsive to the needs of local actors. In doing so, it prioritizes local level and movement-led theories of change. And so it also supports multiple parts of the ecosystem. The report goes into more detail about how public charities like AJWS and private foundations like HU can and do support organizing and movements. But in sum, these two brief case studies show that there's no single type of donor that supports movements. There's no fixed path that a foundation must take in order to support the work of movements and organizers. And you can see the sort of lifespan of these two donors differs quite a bit. So at this point, I want to highlight another finding of the report that relates to donor coordination. Coordination takes time. It often requires donors to adapt, but it's critical when supporting the work of movements, because a lack of donor coordination can be particularly harmful to nonviolent collective action and the people who participate in it. So whereas sort of the success of formal CSOs depends largely on a small number of experts or lawyers or advocates, the main way movements win is by increasing levels of mass participation in society, especially when it's diverse participation. That is to say, movements succeed through mass collective action. And so when donors offer conflicting support, when the support leads to competition or rivalries amongst organizers, movement leaders, or between organizations, then we as outsiders are creating collective action problems. The very support intended to foster collective action hinders it. Now, coordination can happen in country, can also happen in Mexico City, in New York, or London, wherever donors are based. Coordination can happen through bodies designed specifically for this purpose. So the Alliance for Feminist Social Movements and Civicus's Grassroots Solidarity Revolution are two examples. There are others listed in the report. And so if we think about politics as the art of the possible, then movements expand what is politically possible in society. They literally and figuratively expand the political space that formal CSOs need for the legislative reform and advocacy that oftentimes codifies change. So donor coordination can also happen between donors that support formal CSOs and those that support organizing in movements, as they're all part of the same ecosystem. This report, it avoids traditional recommendations. So recommendations for donors, recommendations for activists, recommendations for governments. I thought it would be more useful, and you can tell me if it is, to offer actionable strategies and practices that donors can adopt and adapt. The report includes dozens of examples, including links to learn more, but I'm going to discuss 3 today. The first practice involves deferring to the expertise of organizers and movement leaders. They often come from historically excluded communities. Repression of their work is so common that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when and what kind of repression happens. And so they tend to endure the most harm from unjust and undemocratic settings. The flip side is that they tend to have the most to gain from a movement succeeding. So it's organizers and movement leaders who are the experts in their context. The tendency of some donors, whether explicit or implicit, to sort of impose strategies or timelines or our ideas of what might work on grantees led one organizer to say that donor restrictions and requirements can be more harmful than money. Now, just mention that the Thousand Currents partnership model is one of a number of great examples of avoiding this kind of harm. Some practical strategies to defer to organizers and movements expertise include adding organizers or movement leaders to a foundation board or hiring committee, strategic planning committee. This can help to institutionalize their expertise so that it's incorporated not only in the grant-making decisions at the end, but also in the high-level strategic decisions and planning, such as creating new portfolios or when hiring senior staff. Alternatively, creating a formal advisory committee comprised of past grantees or members of the communities that a foundation serves is another option to institutionalize feedback loops and expertise from organizers and movement leaders. The next practice relates to the idea of reciprocal accountability. You see here. If we seek to build relationships of trust with instead of control over grantees, and if we seek to empower them to achieve their own goals, why don't we encourage them to evaluate us? An example of this that we can learn from is called Grant Advisor. You can see the website here. 3 nonprofits in the US came together to build this site because they believe that grant seekers and grant makers need each other to succeed. And the site is a way to anonymously give and receive feedback on grant making. Grant seekers can find public advice from peers, and it's a place where foundations can get free and honest feedback. So transparency and trust-based relationships are foundational to effective philanthropy. So I share this example in case anyone here wants to innovate on it or adapt it for reciprocal accountability when it comes to supporting organizing in movements. Theo Soa, the CEO of the African Women's Development Fund, put it succinctly: we've ended up boxing activists up. Funders tend to say, we can support your action, but only if you're a registered NGO. And then they end up forming artificial organizations and relationships where people are distracted from the core activity of building power because they're setting up something that's, demanded by outsiders in order to attract resources. So reciprocal accountability is one sort of mechanism that can help avoid boxing in activists. But some of you may be wondering why I haven't said anything about monitoring and evaluation. I'm sure there's at least one of you here who does M&E. There's a lot in the report about M&E, including these two downloadable resources. One is HAWS's movement assessment tool, and it's for donors to better understand movement strengths and the health of the movement. The other is the Global Fund for Women's capacity assessment tool, and that's for movements to help better understand their own strengths, needs, and priorities. I'll also offer two ideas that could provoke you to rethink how we do M&E. We often think of grants as investments, and evaluation of those grants as measuring a return on those investments. But there are other ways to think about M&E. For example, we could consider grants to be a form of reparations. Alternatively, we could think of grants or other support, non-financial support, as a means of seeding power or sharing power. So the report is full of all sorts of other innovative ideas, many of which I just documented, that others developed. Innovative ideas like these that you can consider adopting or adapting into your grant making. I'll just close by saying that sort of maybe identifying the elephant in the room, which is that philanthropy is an expression of donors' political and economic power in society and in the world. And the report offers dozens of actionable principles, practices, strategies that donors can use to better leverage their power to support the work of organizers and movements. And this means focusing not only on supporting activities that seek to achieve more just and democratic power relationships within a society, but also on how to shift power relations with grantees. Now, I know many of you have deep expertise on these themes, and so I view the rest of the webinar as a discussion where we can develop and build on this knowledge and your knowledge together. So for example, I welcome you to share strategies and practices, as well as examples, specific ones, that you think might be useful to others. So thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to our conversation and to Tom's comments.
Thank you so much, Ben. This is very insightful. I'm looking forward to the discussion that's going to unfold from what you've shared with us today. I'd like to introduce our respondent today, Tom Perriello. He's a former congressman from Virginia, a diplomat, and an advocate for human rights and democracy within the United States and around the world. Tom currently serves as the executive director of Open Society Foundations for the United States, a philanthropy dedicated to supporting open, inclusive, democratic societies. During his time in Congress, Tom voted in favor of the landmark legislation for healthcare reform, climate change, immigration, antitrust, and economic recovery. During the Obama administration, he served as the special envoy to the African Great Lakes region and authored the second quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. Tom also served as the president of Center for American Progress Action and senior counselor to CAP, as well as co-founder of Avaz.org and Faithful America. Tom, we are glad to have you here today, and we look forward to hearing your response to Ben's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Ben, for the great research. I can attest to how serious he is about research because we worked together in Egypt, conducting about 500 interviews in the wake of Arab Spring, and he introduced me to the academic idea of methodology. So I was just doing a bunch of interviews, and he really helped turn that into an incredibly useful capturing of where the zeitgeist was at the time, and has just been a lifelong advocate for justice and for peace. I think the two or three things I just want to emphasize here before we get to discussion is, one, this very important shift from a focus on issues to a focus on power. And I want to give some domestic examples of how we have been thinking about this at OSF. You know, in the wake of the uprisings for racial justice after George Floyd's murder, we did a set of 5-year grants to over 20 Black-led, Black accountable movement groups. And part of the thinking there was, in the past, we've perhaps funded on a specific issue like police accountability or criminal justice reform. And if you look at how foundations have tended to split that up, what we do is we disaggregate power. We form hundreds and hundreds of organizations who all have relatively similar aims. The groups that care about police accountability probably also care about dirty drinking water, but we feel the need for that to be a separate organization traditionally. And that just means 2 groups, then 10, then 20, each have to have an executive director, each have to fundraise, each have to fill out their accountability forms and have different membership levels. What we really want is to build power among, or really help marginalized communities build their own power to become mainstream. And sometimes we focus so much on speaking truth to power that we haven't thought about what it means to take power and hold power democratically. And I think we've seen a similar thing in moving from lots and lots of organizations with white papers. As one person put it, we need fewer white papers and more white helmets. The groups that are building power on the ground are often because what are they up against? They're up against repressive power. They're up against some sort of concentration of power, whether that's corporate concentration of power, whether that's a repressive leader. And if we disaggregate people power, then those concentrated centers of power, those authoritarians, are always going to win. And frequently the way we give is to actually spread that power, dilute that power. We need to think about how we help them to build it and build a bigger coalition, a pro-democracy coalition, a pro-human rights coalition. And I think that we can do that. And I think we have seen success with that, again, where we've, as Ben's research said, largely listened to folks. It is also really important to remember, because we can get very cynical, that this stuff works. Nonviolent movements are 2 times as likely to succeed, as Ben noted, 3 times as likely to produce a democratic outcome. And as he noted in the research, these movements are growing, they're not shrinking, despite the fact that we also see this rise of ethno-nationalism and authoritarianism and the very new digital threats that amplify those in such serious ways. The last thing I'll say is, you know, particularly sitting where I do now on the foundation side of things, the barriers that Ben mentioned are not insignificant. Legal barriers, physical risk barriers, and the rest. I recently had the honor to be in Ukraine for about a month with Bird of Light Ukraine, the flag behind me. And one of the limits that many of the traditional NGOs had is that the line between what's purely civilian and what's military there is very blurry. If you're sending a truckload of medicine and food forward, there's a very good chance the person on the other side receiving it is somebody who is either military or, worse yet from our standards, a neighborhood militia person, but they are distributing it in a humanitarian way. This is why we saw groups like Bird of Light and Chef Andre's group actually being more flexible on the ground, because they start with the local resources and how can you support the local resources versus the traditional approach of bringing all that in and having to account for every single dollar and whether it ever touched military hands. So I think we need to not just give more and give more to movements and give more to movements with a long-term eye, and that's the last thing I'll talk about in a second. But we do need to take some of these barriers, like why is the foreign money less effective? Some of that is about narratives of colonialism and imperialism that are real, and we need to address some of the things that undermine that, whereas often the authoritarian groups also get lots of money from abroad, but it doesn't tend to be something that undermines their credibility in the same way. Last thing I'll just say is, because it's a very happy day here in DC, for those who don't know, the White House is doing the official celebration of the climate bill. And there are a bunch of parties going on around town and everything. And, you know, as some of you know, I was in Congress and got to vote for the cap and trade bill 12 years ago, which of course never made it out of the Senate. And the reason I want to say that in this context is we have to be willing to fund for the long term. There were a lot of failures along the way here, but there was learning, not learning in the sense of a report here or there, but I think it was significant that we switched from a neoliberal approach of cap and trade to a green industrial approach. And that came from movements rooting this much more in a racial justice and marginalized community space than a more academic space, honestly, that had always talked about, carbon costing as the key. It was also before a more elite outside the Beltway or inside the Beltway movement. And there were also some very nuts and bolts things. At that time, I told LCB and EDF that they had a reputation of asking for everything from members and then not being there to help fundraise in the election cycle. And quite frankly, LCV is now one of the most powerhouse fundraisers in the Senate. And you went from, while people focus on Manchin and Sinema, the idea that the other 48 were already on board with these policies would have been completely unheard of 10 years ago. So we do need to be willing to, as I say, fund to win and not to show. We often give groups just enough money to kind of be at the table, or maybe not even be at the table, but sitting behind the table. And then we're pissed that they haven't solved structural racism or, defeated an authoritarian in a few years. We need to be serious about what it takes to win in these spaces and what we need to do to put people in a position to win, or at least increase their odds. And I think those are all things that can be done and done successfully and done with great integrity. And I think Ben's report is a great contribution to how that may be so. So really appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation. And thank you all for including me.
Thank you, Tom. That's very insightful. We appreciate your feedback on that. We want to open up the conversation for everyone. First, I want to share that we have the study available for you to download. I've dropped the link inside the chat. So if you click on it, it'll take you right to ICNC's resource library where the entry is available to download. But now we'd like to open the conversation. So there's two ways that you can ask your questions. You can click on the raise hand button. And if you do so, we can call on your name and you can turn on your microphone and you can ask your question over the air. Alternatively, you can also type your question into the question box and we'll read that for you and we'll have the discussion around it. So please submit your questions. We already have several coming in. So let me see what we have here. So someone, Maria Alejandra has asked, can we define the term nonviolent in this conversation? We've seen one way the state punishes dissent is by labeling protesters as violent and increasing penalties or charges for things like blocking traffic. It creates a false binary of violent, nonviolent.
Sure. So I can first, thanks for that. I can first give the sort of academic definition. So the sort of data that I showed about nonviolence being twice as effective as violence, that data comes from an academic data set called NAVCO, and nonviolent describes the primary strategy that a campaign or movement uses to achieve their aims. So a movement or campaign that has a few people throwing, bricks or something, but that are not sort of formally endorsed as part of the strategy, that would still be considered a nonviolent campaign. But a campaign that says, for example, like the ANC in South Africa that had an armed wing that endorsed the use of violence, that would not be considered nonviolent. So it's the definition is not based on whether the regime or the government or sort of outsider says they're nonviolent. It's about the sort of primary strategy that a group or movement uses. There's also debates about whether violence against property should be taken into account as opposed to violence against civilians or violence against sort of legitimate sort of regime targets, and that's sort of an ongoing debate.
Great, thank you. We also have a question. Nico Pluija is asking about your study. Do you only look at US-based funders?
Yep, so this study looked almost exclusively at US-based funders because the tax rules and the lobbying rules and the reporting requirements differ quite a bit from the EU to the US to say Mexico or South Africa. And so to be able to sort of talk about like comparable donors, and because the vast majority of funding comes from U.S. donors for this work, that was the focus. I should say right up front that many of the more sort of innovative movement donors and networks are not based in the U.S. Particularly some of the sort of feminist and women's funds movements are like way ahead than many other sort of groupings of donors in co-creating and partnering with people who the donors are seeking to serve. So with women with sex workers, with people who are trafficked. Those are the folks who are making the decisions about how funding is used in many of these women's funds or feminist funds. So, and much of that work is led and catalyzed by folks in the global South and people not in the US. And so future research that I'd like to do is actually to look at some of that non-US funding, particularly ways of self-generating resources, autonomous resourcing, and particularly support that comes either South-to-South or from the global South for movements within their own country.
Great, thank you. We have a question over the air from Neetha Tangarala. Neetha, would you unmute yourself and then introduce yourself and share your question?
Absolutely, happy to, and hopefully you can all hear me. This is part question, part providing Ben with huge accolades. We are so honored to have Ben, serve as a consultant for USAID, where I'm the senior advisor for youth civic education and activism. Join us over the past few months to really unpack this, and just so excited and happy to see this report. And so just a huge congratulations to Ben, and a huge thanks from all of your colleagues over at USAID. And I know we've talked about this, but I wanted to put this question out there. In many ways feels maybe a little bit too practical, but I think can help in terms of the implementation mindset. But could you further unpack sort of, as you so helpfully pointed out, that so little goes towards grassroots organizing, but say more for reform. And so I sort of think of the DRG sort of programmatic inventories database, and I think about why, and you unpacked a lot of that, but is it because maybe sort of providing a definition of much more of that sort of grassroots organizing, is it because it's sort of conceived of obviously as an action versus an actor, and that's how a lot of donors, and again you got into this, sort of think about in terms of how to actually sort of direct funding? And again, I know you touched on this, but I don't know if you can sort of delve more into the grassroots organizing as in terms of the set of typologies. Thanks.
Sure, and thanks for that, Neetha, for the question and for the good words. So I think grassroots organizing can be done. It's often local. It's done by people who are sort of in their community, and it's about people using the resources they have to build the power they need to achieve the change that they want in society. And so it's led by people within the community to do those things. Sometimes grassroots organizing becomes a bigger thing than just, for example, maybe cleaning trash from your street. Maybe it turns into a movement that's much bigger than just your community. Maybe it becomes regional or national, it takes on bigger goals. And so this is something we see with people. They may start with saying, we aren't given equal access to education, or we don't have the same rights to property or to vote than others in society. And often those demands, those real grievances, sort of expand as people become more involved in activism. They realize that the reason they're excluded from the political, social, economic life of their society is because of elected officials, or because of business folks, or religious leaders, or whatever it is. So often demands change and become much bigger, or systems reform demands, And so both the bigness of the demands and the shifting nature of the demands is traditionally hard for many outsiders and donors to sort of adapt to and to get on board with. And so one of the senior staff person at a private foundation said to me, "There's no such thing as a centrist social movement." And I think generally speaking, he's right? People go into the streets because they're not able to create a political party, because they're not able to vote, because they're beaten up when they try to register for school, right? And so the demands that they're making have been rejected by the status quo, human rights demands, democracy demands often. And because they're not allowed in, because they're forcefully rejected from the institutions, it's not just the demands are sort of far from the status quo, but the tactics that they use, being in the streets, being outside of the institutions, that's also quite different from usually the status quo. And so for outsiders to see people who may not have formal education using tactics that are viewed maybe as extreme or different from the status quo in their society, and making demands that have been rejected by those in power, those are big things for an outsider to sort of grapple with, wrap their arms around, and support in a spirit of solidarity. And so those are a couple of reasons why I think and why we've seen many donors either not prioritize support for organizing and movements, or sort of do it in a sort of partial way, or to learn or struggle with how to do this work. And there's a director of a big foundation in the U.S. who said, they've been supporting climate activists for years, and this executive director says publicly, we've been part of this movement for decades. We make mistakes. We do things sometimes that are harmful, but we keep showing up in moments of failure. We learn, we're transparent about our mistakes. We say what our biases are, what we can and can't do. And oftentimes that transparency and that vulnerability, that courageous learning, those are things that allow us as outsiders to be in solidarity and continue to do it in a way that's helpful, while learning at the same time.
Can I just come in on a couple of those points, because I think it's really important. And it goes back to the really wise question at the beginning about what constitutes violence and how that word is weaponized, particularly against justice advocates. You saw that with again, the post-George Floyd uprising and other spaces. And I think part of this is about the idea that when we do general operating support over many years, I would argue we as foundations actually have greater plausible deniability than when we go in and try to micromanage the grants and say, you must fund in this thing and we want to put the constraints on, because then we are arguably saying that we told them exactly what to do. Whereas if you're funding an organization and maybe you disagree with, say, defund, but you support the other stuff, you can say, yeah, we don't tell our grantees everything to do. We don't approve of that. That's not the nature of our giving. And I think it also goes to Ben's point, and this is something we talked about a lot during the QDDR and in government. In the private sector, you can make 10 bold investments and have 7 of them fail. And if the other 3 go gangbusters, then you're seen as a genius for having taken those risks. Whereas in the government sector, you can have a program that works 99% of the time, but it's the one time it fails, the Congress is going to come after you with oversight and the evening news is going to cover it. So then at USAID and state, we're stuck with all of these procedures to try to manage to zero failure. And when you're trying to manage to zero failure or zero waste, you've guaranteed that you won't succeed. You've guaranteed that you can't innovate. You've guaranteed that you will basically just go steadily on the status quo. So I think this is about a deeper rethink for us in philanthropy about how we get out of the mindset that somehow if one of our grantees goes and does something that some government calls violent, we are vulnerable to that. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist. That's a very real thing for us to think about, but we've got to come up with ways of thinking about and talking about our giving and engagement that make us not liable to that standard that we can't possibly meet, and therefore we just don't engage. I do think the multi-year giving does more of that for us, where we can say, look, we didn't support that particular thing. Other groups disagree and say that's why you've got to pinpoint your grant into a specific thing. But I think that tends to backfire for the reasons noted. So just wanted to add that in.
Wonderful. We are running short on time. We have so many questions. I'd like to ask just two more, if we could just approach them really briefly. And then any questions that we didn't get to, Ben, if it's all right, I'd like to send some of them to you, and we'll post them on our website afterward for people to be able to read. Great. So we have an anonymous question asking, well, first commenting what Tom said about power building is relatable. And in my experience, donors rarely compare and contrast donors and grantees' views on how to build power and exert influence to achieve systemic changes. But I'd like to ask Ben a question to illustrate his point about donors sharing power with partners approach and flexible funding and M&E. What other options are there that you've observed that could also empower grassroots movements to share that power with the donors?
Sure. So I think one way I think about this is that often donors will say, well, when we're making the we're doing the grant making decisions, we're consulting with local partners and local actors. And the reality is that that's just the last end. That's just the end of the grant making process. The sort of bias and the sort of holding of power in a few hands has already happened in many phases before, right? So who is on the board of the foundation? Is there anyone who's been an activist before who can speak when the board is deciding on big, high-level strategic decisions? Are there staff or senior directors who come from the global south, who come from the communities and have used the strategies that folks are using in the areas where that foundation wants to be active? So those are some ways of thinking about sharing power much earlier in the grant making process. And then again, like I mentioned, grant making that is not evaluated for a return on investment, but that is in the spirit of reparations, depending on your context. That's one way of sharing power, saying this foundation has accumulated wealth for all sorts of reasons that may or may not have been sort of discriminatory or abusive. And we're going to become a spend down foundation. And in 10 years, we're going to, as advised by people from these communities, we're going to give all of our support to go into their hands. Maybe they don't spend it all immediately, but maybe activists in Baltimore or Zimbabwe or Venezuela or wherever it is say, you know what, we'll create a fund in our country and we will then be able to make decisions. So the money moves and the decision making is then made on an annual or daily basis, weekly basis by the people from those communities. So those are just a few ways, and in the report there are quite a few others.
Thank you, Ben. We have so many questions, and we will keep track of all of them. So if you haven't had the opportunity to ask it, please write it in the question box or email it to us at webinars at nonviolent-conflict.org. We also have recorded this webinar, and we'll put it online as well and send out a link to all of you so that you can have access to view it again in the future. But our final question, Ben, is from Tenzin Dolka, asking, can you talk a bit more about accountability and what it means for donors to be accountable to movements? It's many times accountability operates the other directions. Can you share any good practices that might have come up in your research? Many thanks.
Sure. And this, just to say this idea of reciprocal accountability is, right, it's sort of grounded in the idea of sort of solidarity and equal relationships, right? So if we're going to have a trust-based relationship, we should probably be able to offer constructive criticism to each other, right? We do this in professional relationships and personal relationships. So why should that not happen in a donor grantee relationship? There are reasons, but it's something that donors can ask. And so there's one example that I'd give from Thousand Currents work, which is that they've made some big shifts in sort of the type of support they give and the timing and I may get this a little bit off, but they've heard back from their grantees and from the communities they work with, who have said, you know, we need something different from you, and they were able to sort of pause and reflect and say, how can we adapt our processes and our priorities such that what we are supporting is the things that the activists, organizers, and movements really need as it changes. There's some others that are listed in the report, but I think this can also happen just on a one-on-one basis when a program officer or director or someone from a foundation is inviting movement leaders to come, maybe paying them to come and present, or going sort of to a region where they're looking to support, and really listening, and not coming in with preconceived notions of what should happen or when or how, and maybe even supporting some things that as a donor you don't quite think will work, or you don't think the timing is right, or you don't think all the actors are there. But you know what? The leaders in the community that have legitimacy and credibility, they're the ones saying this is what we need. And so maybe it's for donors to say, you know what? We're going to take a risk and do what you need and what you want, even if it makes us feel a little bit out of our comfort zone.
Wise closing words. Ben, we thank you so much for sharing your time, for the work that you've put into researching and writing this report. I think it will prove to be exceptionally valuable to people in the donor community, and also to activists who are curious about how things work on that side. There's a lot of insight there. I also want to thank Tom Perriello for joining us today, and Rachel Thomas as well. We invite all of you to go to the link in the chat section to download your free copy of the PDF, and we will send you a recording of this discussion. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and we're looking forward to see what can unfold from our consideration of how we can improve and refine our donating practices towards movements. Thank you very much, Ben. Any last words?
Just to say thanks to everyone for joining. Feel free to reach out to me. You can find my contact information online or through this webinar at nonviolent-conflict.org. I would love to continue this conversation in whatever spaces you hold. And I look forward also to your feedback if there are things you think are off or need to change. So thank you so much to everyone. I hope the report is useful, and look forward to keeping this conversation going.
It's just the start of a long conversation, I think. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to everyone for sharing your time with us.